So welcome to week 2, Science, Technology, and Agriculture. I hope that you're seeing this screen. This is a little bit of an experiment, the first recording I've made for this class. So in talking about food, it's important to recognize that there has been a sort of a science and a technology going back further than recorded history. Some of the first things we know about food involve both lifestyle, sort of anthropological lifestyle following herds with the hunter-gatherers, but also technologies that they used. They would use spears made out of bone and things of that nature. Archaeologists have found a lot of tools that have been sort of roughly fashioned, and this is before language. Okay, so technology and also the science, and particularly the domestication of wheat and other things which allowed the hunter-gatherers to settle in one location. So science, technology, and agriculture is at the very root of what we know about food for our species, Homo sapiens. So, I'm just in the next hour or so, I'm going to go through just kind of a little bit of an eclectic list of different things. Some of them are very, very critically important, but I've thrown some in here that are a little bit more esoteric, but still very, very interesting. All kind of, in some way, shape, or form, linked to either science, technology, or agriculture. And that's not to say that we won't be talking about some other aspects of food in this unit, or that we won't be talking about science, technology, and agriculture when we talk about something that comes a little bit later on. But this is the week where we're largely going to talk about this topic. So we don't have there's very little that we have of the hunter-gatherers that is direct evidence of how they felt about their lives. Most of what we have discovered has come through the archaeological strain of human discovery. But the interesting thing is, what we have found, particularly in cave paintings, has shown an obsession with hunting and with game. In fact, the most famous cave painting of all, which came from Cro-Magnon, a sort of a relative of Homo sapiens, shows probably the predecessor it's either the horse or the cow, I can't remember, with a spear sticking into it. So from the very earliest artistic human expressions, humans were obsessed with the procurement of food. Not too much of a surprise, because food is something that is very, very basic at the very beginning of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Food and water, and then shelter. So what we know about the hunter-gatherers comes from certain what are called middens, which are basically that's middens, middens, which is basically where they threw their trash, dumps, ancient dumps, if you want to think of it that way. And you find out all sorts of interesting things about these people, including what they ate. Okay. They've also, as one of your readings points out, I think it was Osri was the name. And it wasn't just one. They have found multiple people from this era who have been largely preserved either in peat bogs or in particular glaciers, and they have been preserved to the point that they're able to literally open up their stomach and discover what they ate for their last meal. So that's another, sort of join the cave paintings. They've had these archaeological middens, and Osri and other and his or her, I can't remember, I think it's a him, brethren, people who have died, but their bodies, thousands of years ago, but their bodies were preserved, and have given us kind of a little bit of an insight into the hunter-gatherer groups. Furthermore, there's a fourth area, and that is there are still some hunter-gatherer groups that are in existence today. And it mentions one of them in your reading. I'll talk about another one, the San of the southern part, southern Cape of Africa. If you've ever seen the film The Gods Must Be Crazy, it features a San, a member of the San, who actually, by the way, became a Seventh-day Adventist after he made the movie, which is kind of interesting. But the San are a modern hunter-gatherer group, although to a large degree they have lost that within the last 25 years. It was very, very sad when I was in the Kalahari Desert in Botswana. The only San that we saw were not out hunting and gathering, but were begging at a grocery store, reeking of alcohol. So much like many indigenous groups worldwide, the San have largely lost their lifestyle, their hunter-gatherer lifestyle. The one that's mentioned in the reading is more in East Africa. I've never seen them, but my parents have. And okay, so I'm not attacking my parents because everyone does this, but when you're there on safari, what you often do is pay to follow around this group as they hunt and gather. It's almost like an outdoor anthropological thing. Okay, this is very, very common, and this is how they make some of their money. So it's almost become like a tourist thing, which is just kind of again a little bit different than the San, but also not exactly as it originally had been. So largely hunter-gatherer groups have been gone, but the San in the group in East Africa, the name escapes me, were studied throughout the early part of the 20th century when they were still pure hunter-gatherers, but to a large degree that has dissipated. But the paleo diet isn't everything that we think it is today. If any of you have ever been on the paleo diet, first of all, the paleo diet only works if you walk everywhere. Okay, that's the thing. My parents told me that when they followed this group and watched them do their hunt and gatherer thing, they walked like 12 miles in a morning, ate lunch, and then walked another 8 in the afternoon. I mean, they essentially walked all day. So this type of lifestyle was not meant to be the California lifestyle. If you drive from A to B, point A to point B to point C to point D, we just don't have. We're very, very sedentary. Even people who walk a lot today do not walk by the same standards of those who lived 50 years ago, let alone 500 years ago, let alone 5,000 years ago, as these hunter-gatherers did. They would walk thousands of miles, sometimes following the mammoth herds in a year. So when we hear about the paleo diet today, number one, it's not very realistic because we don't exercise in quite the same way. Our exercises tend to be more short bursts, running rather than walking, things of that nature. And furthermore, if you read the reading, you learned that the paleo diet actually did incorporate a lot of carbs. These people would they ate whatever they could, okay, and they weren't carb counting. Okay, the cavemen weren't punching into their calorie counter. They didn't care where it came from. They just tried to eat as many calories as they possibly could. And they knew how to smoke out beehives. And I think the reading that talks about what percentage some of the stomachs that they have discovered, what percentage of it was carbohydrates, and it was as much as 25%. So the modern paleo diet isn't really what... it's more an invention of a modern, it sounds kind of cool to eat like the cavemen did. You can get by eating just meat, and vegetables. You don't eat grains, don't eat this, that, and the other. But it's not the same situation, you might say. Just some other things about the hunter-gatherers. They did follow around their herds that they hunted, bison in the Americas, um, woolly mammoth in Europe and Central Asia. And this did some very interesting things for their society, which don't have anything to do with food, but are just an example of how food can impact culture, how the lack of agriculture, the lack of scientific development, the lack of any technology other than just a killing technology, spears, actually had a societal impact, which was very surprising. Okay. First of all, hunting was very, very dangerous. Okay. It was very uncommon for men to live to an old age. And by old age, I mean like 30. Okay. There's the thought that a lot of these people died young. Okay. Woolly mammoth doesn't like to have a spear stuck into him. Okay. Woolly mammoth is going to do his best not to have if woolly mammoth, if you're circle, if you get woolly mammoth encircled and he sees a way out, he's going to trample you. Okay. And they had to keep following the herd. They couldn't, if you got your leg broken, that they've actually discovered lots of broken limbs that were set crudely. And you didn't need to go very fast. You could hobble along okay. But if you got injured and you couldn't continue, you died, basically. So there weren't a lot of old men. The only thing more dangerous at this point than hunting woolly mammoth was bearing children. Okay. So there weren't a lot of old women either. Okay. A lot of women died in childbirth. But there were women who were able to bear children, either bore smaller children or, for whatever reason, were able to survive a little bit longer. And it's felt like, this is pure speculation, that the women who, for whatever reason, weren't able to bear children, they weren't hunting woolly mammoth, they weren't bearing children, were the ones who lived the longest, and sometimes could live much longer than everyone else. These societies were thus much more matriarchal. Now, they weren't matriarchal. It wasn't like the women were making all the decisions. Okay, it's not the inverse of what we see today with patriarchy, what we've seen for the last 5,000 years. But they were relatively matriarchal, and another reason why was because they linked their time. The thing about being in one place, such as you are with agriculture, where you're plowing a field, so you work the field. When you're set in one place, you mark the passage of time with the sun. Okay, the sun comes up over here, and then it kind of and 365 days later, it comes back to the exact same place in the sky at the exact same time. Okay. Well, when you're moving around, the woolly mammoth were migratory. They would, finding grass, they would graze an area, they'd move to another area. They'd move a couple hundred miles, and they'd graze an area, they'd move another. So the hunter-gatherers were unable to track time with the sun. So they tracked time with the lunar cycle, which is 28 days. And the theory is, and again, a lot of this is speculation, but a lot of it's grounded in sort of these anthropological and archaeological finds, that the other thing that's 28 days is the female menstrual cycle. Okay. And that they linked these two and linked them in this kind of aspect of spirituality. Okay. So, they were more lunar worshiping. They were more lunar focused. And that also perhaps played into the fact that even though there was this kind of division of labor, even though there were some very obvious patriarchal aspects to their culture, they were probably more matriarchal than most cultures, and probably more gender equitable, up until probably the 19th century, okay, from systemic agriculture. It's interesting. There were these groups tended to be small. They tended to be all essentially related to one another. So you didn't have as much crime. Couldn't really steal anything. You had to carry everything with you. So, I mean, the thing about living in one location is you could bury something in the ground. Well, it doesn't do much good to steal something and bury it in the ground if you have to move on in 2 days. So the theory is that there was very little crime because number one, everyone was related to each other, and number two, there really wasn't, a lot of times there it wasn't like there were. I mean, there probably was, perhaps violence of instantaneous anger and aggression and things like that. But the other thing is these groups didn't tend to unless they got big enough. The brother sister cultural taboo. The cultural taboos in regards to in the courtship and breeding were the same as today. And the genetic mixing would come when these groups would run into each other and essentially have arranged marriages. Okay, so there was very little crime. Another thing that this culture kind of engendered was there was no written language. Okay, paper hadn't been invented. The earliest language, which would come after the hunter-gatherers, was clay tablets. Well, you can't carry those things around hundreds, if not thousands of miles. They weigh a lot. You can't carry etched stone around with you. So as a consequence, these individuals had way better memories, is the conjecture, and oral histories. Usually again, this is, I mean, essentially all this stuff is conjecture, were by some of the older men who had survived, and they survived to the point where they were no good as hunters, but they hadn't been killed by woolly mammoth or saber-toothed tiger or whatever. And they would be the memory. They would pass on the stories. And then when they died, someone else who proved that they had a really good memory. The theory is that the printing press, which came about 500 years ago, really started impairing human memory. And that even before that, the ability to write things down, we didn't have to remember everything. So they actually probably had better memories than us. So, all this goes back to their food source. What type of lifestyle they had was in regards to the fact that they had to follow these large game animals around different locations. Okay. And those were the hunter-gatherers. They were done in by two things. Number one, there's kind of been an ebb and flow of temperature. Climate change is not just something that has been a topic of human concern in the modern era, or had a devastating impact, like it's most likely going to on the human condition. The recession of the Ice Age led to the recession of the woolly mammoth, and put more pressure on the European bison. There is such a thing as, it's not just American bison. The European bison went extinct, thousands of years ago, and a lot of animals started disappearing, which were, coded specifically for the Ice Age, who were evolved to live during a cooler time. And that led to the crashing of these populations of people who followed them around. There was less game, which led to starvation and, probably more conflict. And the second one was the Neolithic Revolution. Okay, the movement from the Paleo to the Paleolithic to the Neolithic. And there's different theories, but the thing is, it happens everywhere all at once. One theory, even as recently as when I first started teaching at La Sierra in 2005, when I talked about this in a different class, a class that now Catherine co-teaches, History 105. Even as late as then, people were saying, well, probably what happened. And, sometimes these speculations are so grounded in logical evidence and kind of connecting the dots. Sometimes they're a little fanciful, such as this one. Even as late as 2005, people were saying, well, what could have easily happened is that these people woolly mammoth. They killed woolly mammoth, and he fell on a guy, and the guy broke his leg, and he stayed behind, and his wife stayed behind, and just to die. And the group moved on, and when the group got back, because they tended to go from cave to cave to cave, from shelter to shelter to shelter. When they got back exactly 1 year later, they were amazed to find that these people were still alive. And what they had learned to do was that certain plants you could take the seed and plant it, that these people that were left behind to die, magically discovered systemic agriculture. That's a little fanciful. I mean, I think the theory that's now prevailing is the follow. We're not sure exactly why, but clearly this was something that happened all over the world. It was happening in the New World. It was happening in East, the eastern steppes of Asia. It was happening in more Central Asia, Europe. It was happening in Europe. It's happening in Africa. It was happening everywhere. And it was what it probably was people were, the only thing in common with all these locations is a warming of the climate. Okay. The recession, that's the only thing that can be attributed to everywhere, was that people were desperate, people were starving, and people were trying new things. And people were finding that, hey, wait a second, we can actually get lots of food by doing this. Trial and error, obviously. They already had a good sense of what was edible and what was not because of their gathering. The gathering part. The men would tend to go out hunting. The women would gather. The men would also gather too if there wasn't game to hunt. So they already kind of knew what grew, what was edible, and slowly but surely, over many generations, they discovered that, hey, these plants are doing better. And someone had the leap at one point. Well, we're going to take these things that I threw a bunch of these things, over here, and look, there's lettuce sprouting there. So these little things must cause lettuce, and so they would take these things, which we now call seeds, from things that they planted and plant new ones. Okay, Neolithic Revolution, and they didn't have to move. And going out and hunting a lettuce is a lot safer than going out and hunting a woolly mammoth. Okay, lettuce doesn't get mad and sit on you. Okay, you don't have to stick a spear into lettuce. And a new era was born. Furthermore, they discovered that there were some animals that they could do the same things to. Okay, this came a little bit later, but some of these animals, certainly not woolly mammoth, although they were gone by this point, but something called auroch, an auroch, Auroch. You know what an auroch is, even if you don't realize you do, because good chance the last time you went to McDonald's, you ate a Big Mac with some modern descendants of an auroch in the form of a cow. And these aurochs were very ornery, which means angry and ill-tempered, and much bigger, maybe not much, but bigger than cows are today, and wild and not at all. But what they discovered was if you could catch one of them and chop its nuts off, basically, they weren't nearly as angry anymore. So they started selectively. They kill them for meat, but they also discovered that if you could put a couple of them, of the wild ones, into an enclosure, and they would start producing calves. Some of the calves from a very early moment were much more aggressive and angry, and other ones were just a little bit more passive. So they would kill the ones that were more aggressive for food, and they'd use the lesser aggressive ones for breeding. And then the next generation would have ones that were slightly less aggressive, and then one that was even less aggressive. Kill the one that's more aggressive, and this goes generation after generation after generation after generation after generation after generation, to the point where we are today, thousands of years later. And bulls are still, we've all seen the running of the bulls. You don't want to get in the ring with a bull. They're still very aggressive, but they're not nearly as dangerous and not nearly as aggressive as they were. That's selective breeding of animals. Okay. And they used selective breeding for animals for all sorts of things. Food. Okay. They discovered that in Southeast Asia that there was this animal called either the green or the red jungle fowl, from which most of our modern chickens, that produced two different types of food, eggs and chicken, and served as an alarm clock. Dogs made good alarm systems. If rival villages coming to kill you, it's good to have dogs raise the alarm in the middle of the night, so to grab your spear and go out and protect your family. Transportation, horses, camels, work animals such as oxes, elephants in certain parts of Asia, the Asian elephant. Dogs also were hunting, terriers, bird dogs. You shot something with a slingshot, it would go into the swamp and bring, where there might be poisonous snakes, and bring it out. I'm sure I'm forgetting some other animals, garbage disposals. Pigs will eat anything. So will goats. Lawnmowers. Goats are lawnmowers. And then also economy. Okay. One of the most, this has nothing to do with food, but there's two important insect domesticated animals. One being the bee, which was a foodstuff and also part of the economy, because honey was almost like currency at one point. But the silk moths, the creation of silk, particularly in China, really helped spice and silk opened up the first real globalism in like the 13th and 14th centuries with the Great Silk Road. So the Neolithic Revolution was safer. People weren't dying. It also allowed people who weren't related to each other to live near each other. It was the rise of first these kind of small enclaves, which then became small villages, which then became larger villages, which became towns. Eventually cities. About 3,500 years ago, Babylon and, some of these early cities. And this created a couple of really interesting things that developed, some of which were not good and others of which were. First of all, you can create more food by doing this, okay? Yes, there are occasional droughts, okay? What they discovered in a lot of areas where agricultural really, a lot of the civilizations grew up along low-lying river valleys, such as the Nile, okay? And the Ganges and the Euphrates. These river valleys would flood quite often, and you couldn't grow crops that year, but it more than made up for it, because it'd carry silt from when it would flood. It would carry silt into the field, and the next year they'd have like double the or even triple the crops. So what started happening is a lot of these towns and villages and even cities started developing. They had more food than they could eat, and so what they would do is they started learning how to trade. Okay. Having, substantial trade routes that would spring up from people who lived in areas that weren't quite so good for it. There's not a lot of mining in low-lying plains. Okay, mining tends to be more in hilly areas and stuff like that. So the people up in the hills didn't have a lot of food, but they had a lot of iron, and you needed iron to create weapons to protect your food if you're a city, or to protect your city. So they would have trade routes. Okay, you give us iron, we'll give you food. Hey, it's a win-win situation. The rise of armies, okay, to protect, usually not a standing army, but hey, we have extra food. we now have this iron from these people up in the hills, and these people downriver are making us angry because they're, doing whatever. So we have armies consume a lot of food and they need a lot of steel. We seem to have both right now. Let's go down and kill these people, right? Let's destroy them so that we're the number one city in this area. Armies, okay. Specialization, okay. Not just for food. All of a sudden, in the hunter-gatherer era, almost everybody had to be involved somehow with food, the obtainment of food, or its preparation, or its storing. Okay, you had to have people going out and killing woolly mammoth, but then you had to have people carving up the meat and cooking it over the fire. You had people whose job it was to take woolly mammoth. I love the phrase woolly mammoth, if you haven't guessed, and fashion another spear out of woolly mammoth's leg bone, or to take sinews from woolly mammoth and use bone needles. They have found bone needles and mammoth sinew from their skin as almost a thread to patch up clothing. Everyone was involved in some aspect of food with hunter-gatherers. Well, in systemic agriculture, there was some people that the only time they ever had anything to do with food was when they ate it. Okay, well, all of a sudden now, only about 50% of the history of food has been essentially, going back thousands of years, the history of fewer and fewer people actually being involved in the production of it, freeing up more and more people to do other things, and leading to greater specialization. But at this point, still, maybe half the people were involved in food production somehow, but that left a lot of other people to do other things, okay, and to begin to advance society in other areas that had nothing to do with food, just because they were free from having to do that. And if someone was really good at metalworking, they became a blacksmith, and were metalworking, finding new ways to shape iron and stuff like that. The need for laws, all of a sudden you had strangers living side by side and near each other and stuff like that. Crime was on the rise, to the point that one of the first real civilizations, the Babylonian Empire, we know about Hammurabi because he was so concerned about crime that he put these pillars everywhere that put all these laws and all the horrible things they do to you if you were caught. So the switch of one food system to another resulted in greater numbers of people living together, which led to greater crime, which led to the need for codified laws, and for the rise of kings, or even before that, these kind of strongmen, chieftains. For the first time, in the hunter-gatherer group, you knew and were related to the person that was in charge. In systemic agriculture, it was often someone you had no connection to. You weren't related to them, and you may not even meet them. Okay, so that's kind of falls under the laws. Gender, you see a move much more towards patriarchy during this time. A lot of the gods in their religion tend to be a little bit more patriarchal. It's now a solar, because they're settled in one place, so they use the sun in order to tell time. And that is the advent of what we call systemic agriculture. Agriculture, planting things in the ground. Systemic means that you figure out how to keep doing it year after year after year. Now, these people are very primitive. They did not understand what something that's called crop rotation. Nowadays, if you plant the same thing in the same field every single year, you start to deplete the soil of certain good nutrients, and it starts to put certain bad things into the soil, because every time you use soil, it degrades it a little bit. Well, what they discovered, unless you get silt coming in from the rivers, as I mentioned earlier. Well, one thing that they discovered that was very interesting, thousands of years after this transition, we're talking about now maybe like 1,000 years ago, is that if you don't just go with one monolithic or monoculture crop, let's say you have uh, let's say you take your land and divide it into four. You put yams here, carrots here, peas here, and cabbage here. If every year you switch it, they started noticing, oh, the crops do just a little bit better. Okay, this took thousands of years for people to figure this out, but they discovered, and they weren't 100% sure why. They had a theory, they knew that it had something to do with the soil was better, but what they didn't realize was that cabbage does something slightly different to the soil than carrots do, and that yams do, and that peas do. And if you rotate it, it kind of almost balances the soil out a little bit. Okay. What they then discovered about the year 1500, so only about 500 years ago, is that it's even better than growing four on your plot of four to always leave one empty. So you're only growing three instead of four crops, and you could still make more money. Because that extra year where the soil is like, okay, thank God I don't have any, they're not, forcing yams into me and trying to bury peas in me. I could just sit here and recuperate. Hey, they're able to get bigger crop yields. Okay, well, during this transition, 5,000 years ago, or whatever, to 10,000 years ago, depending on what your time eschatology is, this transition from hunter-gatherer to systemic agriculture, everything happened very, very slowly. It took hundreds of years for a new thing to come in. Okay, but this was a very, very key transition. I think one of your readings, something I don't talk about is pastoralism, which is where you take a flock like sheep and you follow them around. I don't talk too much about that. There is a wonderful documentary, though, of from the 1930s, I think, in maybe it's northern Iran, called Grass, and it's basically two Hollywood filmmakers, the guys that made King Kong in the late 1930s, following these people for a year. These modern pastoralists. Pastoralists were a little bit different than hunter-gatherers, and they were a little bit different than systemic agriculture. They were a little bit more similar to hunter-gatherers, but they weren't killing their animals. They were basically just driving their animals around, trying to find around this area, trying to find grass that their herds could eat. So that was kind of a third kind of area that survived in the 20th century, but is pretty much gone. Okay, I'm just going to, there are a bazillion technologies that I could talk about. Maybe not a bazillion, but probably a billion. I could talk about the donut making machine that if you've ever been to Krispy Kreme, these donuts are lying supine on this, conveyor belt as they work their way towards your stomach. Dropping the dough into the boiling oil. There's all sorts of wonderful machines, but I'm just going to talk about a few, and some of them aren't even really machines. They're chemicals. But the plow is very, very important in that it allowed a greater tillage of the soil. Okay, and when paired with an ox, you could have one person guiding the ox in a straight line and the other person planting along behind. And you could be much more productive. In one day, you could cultivate much more land, which meant that you can cultivate much more land over the course of a season. Okay. The plow was very, very transformative in that it allowed one person or let's say a family, because usually it was more than one person, cultivating much greater plot of land, making food for way more than just the family. Okay, so the plow was very, very important in the sort of explosion of. The plow wasn't it really didn't work by itself. You needed harnesses, you needed a yoke to put on oxen. They discovered that if they put two oxen together, uh, and they were equally yoked, the lines would be much straighter, which made it easier to water, which made it easier to pick, things of that nature. Of course, the Bible is so invested in agriculture, incidentally. There are terms from the Bible that we don't even really realize come from agriculture, particularly when they talked about being equally yoked. These two things are not equally yoked. Your God in heaven, your Father in heaven, and your father, King Herod or whatever, on in Jerusalem are not equally yoked. Okay, they're not equal. Okay, this was a phrase that denoted equality that came directly from plowing. Of course, the plow gives way to the tractor in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, which were very non-functional at that point. But certainly by after World War I, tractors were quite functional and really, in many ways, led to the Dust Bowl. Tractors allowed you to do a lot more to do 100 times the amount of land that the people in early systemic agriculture were able to do, and 10 times with the people with the plow. But they could be very, very disruptive to the topsoil, and they could erode the topsoil. And then if you got a drought where it didn't rain a lot, wind, which normally wouldn't pick up the sort of the wetish, heavy topsoil, the topsoil was now very light and could get blown away. And if topsoil got blown away, the soil underneath it wasn't very good quality and did not produce very good yield. So the tractor led to the erosion of the land, although they slowly but surely figured out what they could do about that, including if you're in drought, you have to water the fields just to keep the dirt. You're really watering the dirt sometimes. You're not watering the crops. Of course, that now has led to the combine, which are these like factory, tractors that look like spacecraft. They're gigantic. I mean, they're maybe like 100 feet across, with these booms and discs and blades and all sorts of stuff. They'll often create the plow, plant the plow, and cover the furrow, and maybe even plop some fertilizer down, all with one pass. Now you can do 1,000 times what people were doing in the early era of systemic agriculture. Fertilizer is important. Stuff that make it grow. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. But, there are things that help crops grow. Then there are other things which kill the insects that want to feed on the crops. It's not just insects. Birds also like to get down there. There's a lot of seed-eating birds. So they would create these scarecrows, these things that would sit out there that would theoretically scare the birds away. So certain technologies, certain things that they discovered early on. I mean, we're talking about thousands of years ago, such as human feces or feces from their cow or whatever. Basically, they didn't realize it at the time, but it was nitrates. And nitrates are very, very commonly found in human waste, that if you put this stuff on there, things grow more. And they also found that there were certain things you could do, like, for instance, I can't remember. Actually, no, it's mosquitoes that don't like garlic. It's not. But they found that there were certain things that helped keep insects to a minimum. Those were early insecticides. Of course, preservatives allowed. We'll talk more about spices in a later bullet point. But there are things that you could add to food that once you made the food, it wouldn't spoil nearly as quickly. Okay, you could put some of this stuff in there, and the food would last longer. Now, it could travel, and this was great for armies or other people that would travel. People involved in trade. Positive contact between two groups, people involved in armies, negative contact between two groups, people trying to kill each other. That there were these ways that you could put things together in a way that they would travel. I mean, they found that if you kind of boiled berries with fat, I mean literally just animal fat and a few other things, and put it all together, would kind of create this gelatinous mass, and the berries wouldn't spoil. Okay, this was called in the New World, among certain Native American tribes of the Americas, American Indians. I think it was called pemmican. With Eskimos also, they take like seal blubber. They didn't have berries, but they'd add other stuff in there that normally would rot. But if you boil it all together, it lasts a lot longer. Okay, so sort of preservatives, natural preservatives, although now we have highly engineered chemical things that serve to do the same function. The refrigerator was important also for the preservation of foods and the ability. The first refrigerators were called ice boxes. Okay, in fact, icebox was used until after World War II into the 1950s. You can still see it if you're reading like books from the 1950s or watching like old movies from the 1950s. In fact, the first refrigerators were actually freezers. Okay, some people didn't need to do this. Like if you're in Minnesota in November, you can just go stick whatever it is out in the shed, and you don't have to worry about it until the spring thaw in like late April. Everything's frozen. But if you're in Southern California, they discovered that if they could have these airtight rooms, and you put a bunch of ice in there, including these big blocks of ice, it would take a long time for these things to melt. Despite it being, and they figured out some early insulation type technologies. You could have something in there. You could put in meat in there for a long time, and it wouldn't go bad. So refrigerator. Now, ovens. There's always been cook fires, even from the hunter-gatherer times. We just have a slightly more sophisticated way of doing it. There was clay ovens. Benjamin Franklin even created the Franklin stove. Now we have gas ovens and gas or electrical or induction stovetops. Okay, so we've even got the microwave, which zaps things with X-rays, and we've even gotten to the point where, I don't know if you're like me, I'm embarrassed by the number of stupid kitchen gadgets that I have. That sounded cool. Hey, it's only $9.99. I'll get that. It's like this thing, like this spinning wheel that had blades in it. That all I have to do is put the garlic clove in there, and I spin it back and forth, and the husks come out one end, and garlic comes out the other. Well, number one, they never work as well as they do on TV. And number two, I don't eat garlic all that much, but it looked really cool, so I bought it. And I have this kitchen gadget, so I must be okay. We're at the point where we have so much technology. Here's another one: an apple corer. Well, why not just eat the apple and throw away the core? But somewhere in my garage, gathering dust, in some box that probably has a black widow living in it, because I haven't opened it in 20 years. I have an apple corer, okay? And I used it twice and then put it in the garage. And I'll probably, when I die in 30 years, it will, let's live longer than that, 40 years, my niece and nephew will probably pull it out and say, what the heck's this? So, our technologies have gotten so sophisticated that we really have technologies we don't really need, is the point I'm trying to make here. And then, I've already talked a little bit about methods, but I just want to talk a little bit more. The first methods for meat and trying to preserve it a little bit longer. When they killed woolly mammoth, they gorged themselves. They would just eat and eat and eat, because that's you couldn't carry the whole thing with you, but you could carry a lot of food with you. Okay, they carried everything they needed, and all you really needed was your clothes, your weapons. Other items that, other tools that they needed, and a few other things. But they also needed enough food to get from, they knew that, okay, the woolly mammoth they're walking the woolly mammoth are going 200 miles to the next big valley where there's a lot of grass. We need to go 200 miles, and that's going to take us 10 days. We need to have 10 days worth of food. Well, they could carry it, but it would spoil. So what did they do? They smoked it. Okay? They smoked it. Fires were actually probably more for some of the meat that has been found in stomachs has been, first of all, it's all undercooked, and some of it's not even cooked at all. Okay? The smoking was the fires were more probably for safety, and were more for curing the meat. Okay, so they ate a lot of smoked meat. They ate a lot of cooked meat, but it was more so that it wasn't because they liked it necessarily, or they thought it was more hygienic, or they were worried about E. coli, or what other version of E. coli woolly mammoth has. They were instead smoking this meat so that it wouldn't spoil, and they could carry it with them for a couple of weeks, and it would be fine. Particularly when at some point during this transition to systemic agriculture, there was a discovery that, if you add spices to meat, it also helps cure it. If you salt it very heavily, if you spice it very heavily, meat lasts a little bit longer. Okay? It's not going to last forever, but it does last longer. So, particularly if they could find spices and salt and stuff like this, they'd put this in there. And there were certain regions of the globe that had a lot more of this stuff than others, including particularly Asia, India, China, a few other places. Europe was a little poor when it came to cinnamon and saffron and salt and pepper and these other spices. This imbalance of silk and spices in the East and other things that were very necessary in the West that the Easterners wanted led to the first real kind of global trade called the Great Silk Road, where Marco Polo went to China. Maybe most people think he did. A lot of people think he didn't. Who knows? But there certainly were Europeans who were going all the way to China and becoming fantastically wealthy if they could make it home without being robbed and murdered, with just cinnamon or nutmeg or cloves or pepper, things of that nature. And it largely was because they wanted to, preserve their meat. Rotten meat. If you've ever wondered why the French innovated all these wonderful sauces, Béarnaise sauce, and all this other stuff, it was to cover up rancid meat. Okay, so you couldn't taste that the meat was starting to go bad. If it went bad enough, you know. But if it was just starting to turn just a little bit, okay, hey, add some Béarnaise sauce to it and tastes fine. And then I want to talk about milk. You notice three of the videos were each very short, but I 3 videos about pasteurization and homogenization, and a little bit about the milk debate. Homogenization is if you drink milk straight from a cow, and if you let it sit around a little bit, it gets kind of, it's very watery. I mean, there's different levels to it. There's watery, and there's fattier elements. Even the fattier elements, which are more like cream, are very clotted. It's not very even. Homogenization is making it so that it has a consistent fat content and becomes more of it's the difference between a solvent, a solution, and a colloid. It's been 25 years, 30 years since I took chemistry in high school, so I don't remember which is which. But milk today, it's all one formula. You let it sit there for a week, and if it hasn't spoiled, everything's still the same. Whereas if it comes straight out of a cow before homogenization, if you let it sit overnight, you have to shake it up, and stir it up, and it's still a little weird and has little pockets of fat and stuff like that. That's what homogenization is. Pasteurization is essentially making it safe, okay? Cooking it in some fashion to kill off all the little beasties that live there. Milk, historically, non-human milk, but drinking milk from other creatures has been historically very, very dangerous. In fact, breakfast was the most dangerous meal of the day up until about 150 years ago, when they were able to start doing some of these things. So, that's certainly milk, making milk safer through homogenization and pasteurization was a very, very good thing. But there's a current kind of, and I think it got started with the whole back to nature movement in the 1960s. And certainly it's like it's a very vegan thing. And I'm not just talking about your vegan that's a vegan for health. I'm talking about a vegan who's like considering changing their name to Moon Unit and I want to live in the woods for the summer and just kind of back to nature and kind of all these different weird ways, not just for health reasons. Ooh, hey, I want to have natural milk. Okay, well, first of all, if you drink human milk, and that's a little weird when you're 35 years old and drinking human milk. That I'm not sure it's a cultural bit taboo, but it's just not something that you do. So number one, there's nothing natural about natural cow's milk. We weren't raised drinking it. It's not part of our biology. It was meant to nourish an animal that will eventually be 800 pounds. So there's something a little weird about the milk debate to begin with, okay? About whether or not it should be homogenized or pasteurized. Agreed, pasteurization kills off some nutrients, as does homogenization. Now they add nutrients back in, but they're kind of artificial. Okay? So, when it comes to the milk debate, you need to decide on one hand, do you want to risk getting sick and be back to nature, but really a nature that only goes back a few thousand years and not much before? Or do you want to have something that's maybe tastes good, is a little nutritionally suspect, is safe, and also isn't something that goes back more than a couple thousand years? Or if you just don't want to drink milk at all, that's up to you. Now, there is a milk debate that does involve human milk that I just put in here, which is food. In fact, it's the first food that we grow up eating as animals, as mammals, as primates, is milk. Okay, and actually exclusively for a bit of time, as do most mammals. Milk is often the first thing. Well, there's a big debate, and it's actually not as big now as it was maybe like 10 years ago. I remember it being very big, about 10, 15 years ago, about the time my niece was born. In fact, I had a friend. I mean, I don't know why she kept sending me this stuff. I told her I'm never having children, so I don't really care, But I think my sister had told her, stop sending me this junk. And so she was trying to send it to me to proselytize my sister. But we had this friend that, was, if you feed your child formula, you might as well take a baseball bat and hit them. Literally, she was saying things that crazy. She was utterly convinced that it was a form of child abuse to give your child formula, which is artificial milk. Okay? Now, some women that give childbirth have to have formula. Not everyone produces milk in quite the same fashion. Some type milk goes away. If the baby has to be hospitalized for a bit, the milk will dry up. So some people have to have formula, okay? Either exclusive formula or sometimes supplementary. Some people just want to do it. And I think there are definitely studies that suggest that it's healthier to nurse. But my friend, our family friend, was he 6 or 8? I think he was 8 years old when they stopped nursing. She would breast pump milk for him to take to school. Okay. I hope none of his little buddies ever discovered that. I can't imagine how humiliating that must have been. But, her whole thing, and, there is some science to back up that it's very important in the first year or so. But, if that's the case, my child is if I breastfeed my child if I breastfeed my child until the age of 25, he'll never die because he'll have the strongest immune system ever. I mean, that was kind of her philosophy. So the whole nursing versus formula milk debate, a separate one than the videos that you watched, is very, very interesting as well, because it is the very first, it does involve the very first food that we eat. Most of us natural milk, but some of us formula. Okay, gardening is another thing I want to talk about. Historically, it hasn't just been the farmers that have grown food for society. A lot of people would have their own gardens. Today, when we talk about having our own gardens, it's usually more flower-based, but the further back in time you go, the more food-based it was. They would call it a vegetable garden. My dad still has one. I'm not sure he did one this spring, but has in the past done a vegetable garden. I actually helped Professor Sutter when Professor Sutter started a community garden in 1993 when we were both students at La Sierra University and cultivated a third of an acre. Gardening was a way people could help sustain themselves. They wouldn't be able to maybe grow all their food, but they could grow enough of it that they could buy what else they needed without really having to expend a huge amount of resources. Okay, even until the early 20th century, you saw people still having vegetable gardens. Or having trees that they, fruit trees that they would cultivate, but it started to kind of, decline a little bit for several reasons. Number one, you saw the rise of large. There'd always been, not always, but I mean, throughout American history, there were these large plantations that cultivated food crops and would create food crops in bulk. But you started seeing more and more of that with more and more types of fruits and vegetables. We saw that here in Riverside in the late 19th century, early 20th century with oranges. Okay, oranges went from being something that was unheard of in the United States to being something that there were just a few trees here and there, and people in Florida and California would maybe plant a few in their yards, and to all of a sudden the discovery that, hey, Riverside's a really good climate for oranges, and we can do these mass plantings and produce oranges for the entire west coast of the United States. You started seeing pineapple plantations, and you started seeing plantations that were dedicated exclusively to certain food items. You started seeing the greater footprint of global trade in American foreign policy that we're going to read about in the book Bananas, by the way. That starts catching on in the late 19th century, early 20th century. So people don't need to grow their own stuff nearly as much. Furthermore, you see a wave of immigrants coming into the country who aren't involved in the big farming production, but grow their own gardens, vegetable gardens and fruit gardens, orchards, just on very tiny plots of land, and who are very, very good at growing this, including large, particularly in the United States, Japanese immigrants. Okay, most of the gardeners in before World War II were Japanese, not of Latin American background, and they grew. They did landscaping. They grew fruit and vegetables, and they grew flowers, and they sold them from the back of their trucks. They called them truck gardens. And you still see this today. You're driving along a semi-rural route, and there'll be somebody with like a little fruit stand set up, and you could tell it's something they just drive out with their vehicle and put everything out. That used to be very, very common, and there were specific places you'd go where they'd have a whole bunch of these, almost like a farmer's market, but largely with immigrants. Of course, World War II came along. The Japanese in California, and particularly the Riverside area, more Japanese Americans lived in Riverside than any other city in the United States in World War II because of the orange industry. And that was sort of, the Japanese then came out of the camps, tried to go back into their jobs and they were all gone and moved into other industries. But two things kind of helped move Americans back to their own gardening, you might say. One was the Great Depression. Okay. It didn't matter if things were very, very cheap. You couldn't afford them if you didn't have a job. So people started kind of, during the Great Depression, you saw more people starting to plant more gardens in their backyard and stuff like this. You saw the rise of the casserole also, and just kind of these communal stews. What are we going to make today? Well, whatever we have, we'll just throw it all together, put in some flour and milk and a few eggs and stir it all up together, and it's mystery casserole. And then World War II quintessentially, in what were called victory gardens. In World War II, you were considered unpatriotic if you didn't have a garden. Every vegetable you bought at the store, you were stealing from the mouth of a member of the armed forces who's fighting Hitler, who's fighting Hirohito. Okay? So they were called victory gardens because I'm helping feed, by me not needing food from the store, but from my backyard, I'm helping feed this troop well, so that when the battle comes, he's well nourished and can fight. Okay, and they had posters that they put up all over the place. And I can't remember; it's either 40% or 60%. I think it's 60% of the fruits and vegetables that were grown in World War that were consumed by Americans on the home front in World War II were grown at home or by your neighbors. I mean, a lot of times, some people lived in the cities. They'd get a bunch of their stuff from their brother in the countryside or whatnot, and they would do a lot of what's called canning. I think one of the articles that that you read talks about the sale of pressure cookers goes up, tremendously during World War II. And it's because people who had bigger gardens and, were growing more food than they could possibly eat were canning it so they could eat it later, or they could take it into the city and give it to friends and family. Okay. We've all seen this. Have you ever gone out to the front door and there's a big bag of oranges and, oh, Mr. Smith down the road, or, Miss Benitez, her fruit trees have come in and she has way more oranges than she possibly needs or that he possibly needs. And all of a sudden now, everyone in the neighborhood is getting oranges. It was the same thing. Okay. And the way that this canning worked, and I've seen it done because people in that era continued to can well after World War II. And I'll tell you a story about my grandparents in just a second. But I actually saw canning in action. What they do is they would take these jars of these, mason jars, they called them, of just glass jars, basically. Put a bunch of peaches in, put some water in, or I guess it was water and a little bit of sugar and a little bit of pectin, so it would last a little bit longer. I can't remember. I was a kid at the time. And then what they would do is they would fill it right to the brim, and they would screw the top on tight, and it had a little place where you could write what it was, just in case you can't tell by looking. Peaches. And my grandmother would do peaches halves, peaches quarters, peaches. There was cubes or whatever. There were different types of peaches. But there's a little bit of air in there, and what will happen is it will spoil if the oxygen is allowed to be in there. So what they would do is they would put these. You could actually just do it. You don't even need a pressure cooker. You could if you put these things in and you boil water hot enough, the heat will cause it to use up the oxygen, and that top of the mason jar. The way it will be good is it will go because all of a sudden it's sucked in. All the oxygen's been burned off by this boiling water that it's immersed in, and then you let it cool, put it up on the shelf, and you can eat it 6 months from now or whatever. So canning. My grandparents lived during the Great Depression and World War II. They were so psychologically marked by this. This is my mom's parents, who were a little bit more working class, a little bit, yeah, they were poor, I guess. I mean, they didn't, they they had a lot of land. I mean, they had like 3 acres. They didn't have a lot of money, but they had plenty of food because a lot of those acres were cultivated, and they worked hard. I mean, my grandfather could barely look level. He was so stooped over with osteoporosis. I mean, bad. I've rarely seen a man with that bad osteoporosis, because a lot of men don't. You know, it's mostly a disease that impacts women. Uh, he could barely walk by the time he got about 80 years old, and he would go out and pick the corn, shuck the corn, give it to my grandmother, who would then cook it, and then I would accompany him as he picked up all the. You know, this is like in 19. I want to say this is like in 1990. You know, I was 18 years old or whatever. We'd pick up all the husks of corn and the stalks, and we'd walk a mile to where he knew there was a guy that had a goat, and we'd throw it over the guy's fence so the goat could eat it. Okay, you didn't waste anything if you lived through the Great Depression and if you lived through World War II. And you know, we're not in quite the same way, but I do think that we're going to have a different relationship to food. I don't think coronavirus is going to modify our relationship to food quite as much as the Great Depression and World War II did for that generation, but it is going to change the way we think about food. There's no doubt about it. A few other things. I'll go through these a little bit more quickly. I can't see the timer. I think I've gone for a little bit more than an hour. Farm bills. If you know, the ironic thing is, for anyone of a particular political persuasion that says, "Oh, we can't be socialist," you know, we're going to turn into Venezuela. We already have dozens and dozens and dozens of socialist policies that make our economy and our culture and our society work. Now, that's not saying that we should add more. I'm not advocating for that necessarily. And this isn't the class where I talk about these types of things. But just let me give you a few examples. The reason that 1 out of 3 people in France did not have electricity by 1960 was that they charged you, they didn't socialize the electrical grid. Can you imagine how much it takes to pump electricity out to someone who lives out in the middle of the desert in Riverside County versus that lives in Riverside? If it costs 100 times the amount to pump them electricity, pump water. What do you do with electricity? You emit electrical waves. You beam electric. I don't know, but people that lived in you wouldn't have people living in rural areas. You would either have people living in rural areas that use candles, or what you do is you do a little bit of price fixing. You do a little bit of subsidizing. You do a little bit of equalizing. That's socialism. Same thing with trash. Okay. If you charged me, okay, not me, I wouldn't do this, but I'm just going to use myself as an example. If you charged me trash by the pound, I'd wait till the middle of the night and I'd go dump my trash in your yard. Okay. And you do the same to me. So that when it came time to weigh my trash, I hardly have any trash. Okay, so trash is also socialized in many ways. The same thing goes for a lot of different foodstuffs. Okay, particularly with corn, wheat, and vegetables. Things that are grown in farming, in particular. Now, a lot of these subsidies have disappeared, but the one that you're going to read all about in the first 100 pages of this wonderful book. The Michael Pollan book, The Omnivore's Dilemma, is the corn subsidy, particularly in 1973. Okay, now what the subsidy is you're basically paying farmers. You're trying to set a production level of farming. Okay, you don't want farmers to underproduce because then there's not enough food to go around, but you also don't want them to overproduce either, because then you have a lot of excess food and it drives the price down. Okay, you can try to sell it off to foreign countries and stuff like that, but it's very complex. These farming subsidies are very, very complex. It was interesting to me, believe it or not, the only political the best of my knowledge, the only the only politician when I was hearing them talk, during the Iowa caucuses, Kamala Harris knew a lot about farming subsidies and whatnot. I think Biden knew a little bit too, but I can't remember. Kamala Harris had some experience somehow, and she just absolutely surprised all these farmers, these middle American white conservative males were astonished that she was a woman, she was a person of color, she was relatively young, and she was from California. Knew a ton about farming because it is this very I'm teaching this class. I've written papers about food, and these subsidies are very, very complex to try to figure out all the different moving parts because it has something to do with how much corn is being produced here, how much is here, how much is here, what the projected market is. All these economic factors that lead into this algorithm that determines what the corn subsidy will be. GMOs, genetically modified organisms. I hate to laugh. When I hear people talking about GMOs, what they're really talking about is lab-based GMOs, because almost everything that they view as organic is a GMO. Okay. If you were to travel back in time, a couple thousand years, and go eat a banana, it would be unedible. Okay, those tiny little black things in a banana? Those are seeds. Well, if you find a wild banana now, the seeds are like this big. I mean, it's almost unedible. Most of the fruits that we have now are the product of hundreds, if not several thousand years of selective breeding. Well, that's a genetically modified organism, okay? But when people are talking about the evil of GMOs today, they're really talking about chemicals, and they're talking about laboratory. And I mentioned, I think last week, that I read 20 years ago about the fact that the tomatoes at that time had been they had had it must not have been 20 years ago, because I don't think they were doing this level of genetic. Maybe it was 10 years ago. It was a while ago, because I can't find the article anymore. That somehow they had genetically manipulated the code of tomatoes to put, I think it was firefly DNA in there. And they had discovered, that they're doing hundreds of tests, trying everything they can think of under the sun. And they discovered that these tomatoes were very frost resistant. And so at this time, people were eating fireflies without even knowing it. Okay, very little, but still, that is GMOs. Selective breeding is old school GMOs in the laboratory with companies such as Monsanto. Is new age selective breeding. Now, Monsanto gets a bad rap, and quite frankly, they deserve it. You're going to read one person who said, "Oh, I was a big fan of Monsanto," and I don't know whether or not that's true or not. Maybe, who knows? But most farmers hate Monsanto. Most politically engaged individuals, including millennials, vegans, I hate Monsanto. They're a pretty scummy company. And as a teacher, I don't like to offer too specific critiques of these types of things. But just keep in mind, for those of you that have taken my Zyklon B was not Monsanto. That was actually a different company, now that I think about it. But some of these horrible technologies that have been used in warfare to kill, like the Jews, Zyklon B, or the Vietnamese villagers with napalm and Agent Orange, were created in laboratory settings, usually in universities, such as napalm, or with food companies such as Monsanto and Agent Orange. Roundup, which we use, most of us, for weeds in our gardens, but it's also used in with the production of some foods in unregulated areas. comes from a food company, in essence. Okay. Another reason Monsanto, I think, is they patent individual seeds, not strains of seeds. They patent an original seed, and it makes it that much easier for them to sue people, because what happens is when you buy seeds and plant them, there are always seeds that are left over in your tractor. They just don't make it into the ground. Now, what the farmers like to do is they like to collect that and use it again. Well, each seed is patented, and it's a one-time use only thing. And Monsanto has been ruthless. I'm talking about absolutely ruthless in driving out small farmers. When I say small, they only have 1,000 square acres. I mean, small is a relative term. But Monsanto has been part and parcel with driving out the smaller farmers and helping conglomerate these bigger and bigger farms that are kind of, almost in bed with Monsanto. I mean, Monsanto has definitely picked who they want on the playing field and who they don't want, and have gone after this aggressively. And there's really very few restrictions. The FDA director, former FDA directors get put on their, Monsanto will go after politicians, put them on their board. And they're really one of the more suspect companies that has something to do with our food production. They have a huge amount of power. They're one of the more powerful lobbying interests in Washington, D.C. So when you're reading about GMOs, you see no GMOs. Number one, terminologies are kind of, are not very precise and not very well thought out. When you go, I'm going to buy an organic banana. Well, I guarantee you the non-organic banana that you're buying is actually organic. Okay. It was grown on a tree, just like the organic banana. But as Michael Pollan illustrates, these terminologies were created to suggest something about how they were grown, the processes by which they were grown, and then later co-opted to the point where it's ridiculous. Now, free-range chicken means nothing. Organic something means nothing. And even something that you think isn't organic is still organic. Same thing with GMOs. When we talk about GMOs today, we're really talking about laboratory DNA splicing and stuff like this through a microscope, not what people were doing naturally, planting trees and then, okay, this tree is producing big seeds and this one's small seeds. We're going to cut down this tree and plant from this tree. Same thing they were doing with the animals, domestication of trees. Okay, so I hope you watched the whole fake food thing from China, which is just absolutely crazy. The fact that they're using industrial chemicals and dyes and materials to create fake eggs that are very similar, and that people are going home and actually dying from eating this stuff. That people, but the thing is, and I think we know a little bit more about some of the lack of regulation of Chinese food industry because of the coronavirus, which started in a wet market in China. You don't have to go back that far. It's a ways now, but it's only about 100 years since the American, 120 years since the American food industry went through the same process, with some things that were really disgusting when it came to meat. Some of the more famous stories from Chicago in particularly, someone would go missing in the meatpacking plant, and the assumption would be that they fell into the vat. That's the last place anyone saw them, and hey, he's there, and then you look up and he's gone, and he's nowhere else. And when asked, should we stop and should we throw away all this meat? The response would be, well, just grind it all up together. We can't waste this much good beef. The fact that rats would be, thrown into this stuff, the fact that they would take like peas, and I think, or was it peas? I can't remember what the story was from the jungle, but they were using copper to make something look green. I can't remember what it was. copper being very, very dangerous for humans to take in large quantities. So, the United States does have a history of this. It was very famously documented in a fictional book called The Jungle, but it was really a fictional story it was really a story about socialism based on this fictional story family. But the author said, these parts where I am describing the meat industry in Chicago. So he went and lived in Chicago and was undercover and asked all these, did all these interviews and stuff. He said, this is not fictional. This is true. And it was just, we're going to talk more about The Jungle later when we talk about a few organizations. And it was so psychologically, it just enraged the country, including the president at the time, Teddy Roosevelt, who brought in a lot of policies that we'll talk about a little bit later. But just note that science and technology can be used to create these fake foods that are very, very dangerous. They aren't really food at all. If I guarantee you, if we have food shortages, you're going to start seeing this. You've already seen this with a non-food item because of the coronavirus. I don't know if about a month ago, you saw that somebody had created their own cleaner and was selling it at 7-Eleven, and people were getting these hard chemical burns because somebody was trying to create their own cleaner to make money. Okay. We're not aware that it happens with food right now, but I wouldn't be surprised if it happens a little bit, and who might happen more in the future. And then finally, waste. This is the final aspect of science, technology, and agriculture I wanted to talk about. Well, like I mentioned, people noticed that urine, and in particular feces, helped things grow. Okay, so they didn't have sewage. So what did you do? You used your effluents to help create more food. You use the effluents from the animals that the cows that you had or the sheep or whatever. Why would you waste this stuff? Okay, as an early fertilizer. Another thing that wastewater has been used for is irrigating. Okay. Now sometimes it's just runoff. It's not human waste, but human waste has been used for fertilizer. And in fact, the prevailing attitude is, and I think there's some evidence of this fact, that it has in other countries. There's a recommendation that you don't eat salad when you travel to certain parts of the world, or if you do that, you wash everything very, very well. Okay. There's certain foods that we get from Latin America or South America or Asia. And occasionally we get these outbreaks of hepatitis or E. coli. E. coli is usually something found in meat. So why are we getting E. coli from spinach? Well, it's probably because that E. coli was fertilized or watered with human effluents and then was not washed properly. Okay? It's called fecal oral transmission. We tend to think of it at restaurants with people who don't wash their hands as well as we'd like and then go off to the kitchen to make your burrito or to make your hamburger. But it could also happen through the fields and cultivation in agriculture as well. And then finally, something that's just absolutely crazy. They can purify water at a purification plant. They can take human waste water with human, they can take raw sewage and they can make water purer than what you buy at the store and than what comes out of your tap. It's the purest water you could possibly hope for. No one will buy it. So you know what they do? And this is crazy, folks. They pump it into the ground and then they pump it back out of the ground and they sell it as spring water. Okay? Some of the water that you drink that's spring water, it says spring water on there, is actually water that passed through you 6 months ago. And when you flushed it down the toilet, when you went to the bathroom, it went into a sewage farm was processed into pure water, was shipped off to another site where they pump it into the ground, they pump it back in, the truck pumps it out, the full truck pumps it into the ground, moves, takes it back up, goes to the bottling facility, they bottle it, take it to Stater Brothers or Albertsons or Ralph's, and sell it back to you. Okay? So just something to keep in mind as you're drinking your water bottle, as you're watching this PowerPoint. Thus endeth the first PowerPoint. An hour and a half. I'll need to be a little bit less verbose. Actually, we're supposed to have 4 hours of class. I think an hour and a half of lecture with time for you to do the homework and watch the things, plus do the discussion topics and start reading the books for the book report is just about right. So it's going to be an hour to an hour and a half whenever I do one of these. We'll see how it works.